which was very highly focused on me and God, rather than me and the church and God, all being a part of the formula, me and God, me and the church, and that they have to be both. So the feeling was we needed to talk about what does it mean to be Catholic and believe in one Catholic and Apostolic Church. There's nothing new about the theology of the Tractarians. In fact, one would claim that in fact all it was a hashing up of what was old. And I sort of joke about, there was a priest in this diocese, unfortunately a few years ago, who, because of squabblings going on in the parish, ended up being inhibited because of plagiarism. He was apparently copying some devotions off of some emails or off the internet and putting them in his bulletins or in his sermons as his own material. And so I always have to warn people, on occasion, that if you hear me say anything wise or great, just assume that somebody else said it and that I just remembered it. Because I really don't, when it comes to theology, I try not to have original thoughts because I haven't grasped all the foundational ones yet. So that could be a part of it. And so the idea, of course, was that we should have the faith of our fathers. We need to have the foundation of the faith of our fathers. And that, does everybody know the hymn "Faith of Our Fathers"?
Living still.
Right, it's living still in spite of fire, dungeon, and drawer. That is a wildly popular Anglican hymn. The irony of it was written by one of the friends of John Henry Newman, a man named Father Frederick Faber. He wrote it after he became a Roman Catholic, Father Faber did. And in fact, what the hymn is really about is the Catholics in England fighting against the Church of England. And yet it's the Church of England people, so much so that when we sing the hymn, the second verse, stanza says, "Faith of our fathers, faith and prayers, will bring all nations unto thee." The original version of the hymn by Father Faber is, "Faith of our fathers, Mary's prayers, will bring all England back unto thee." So it is kind of funny that we as Anglicans have adopted this, but Father Faber meant it for something very, very different. So in the beginning, what was the fault, if you could give a fault for the Oxford movement at the beginning, was that it was incredibly cerebral. The idea of it was very much, it was a thinking man's argument about the nature of the church. And so the original years of the Oxford movement had more to do with people arguing around the rectory and having some highfalutin sermons in an academic setting with people who were studying theology. It wasn't really affecting people in the pews, the average Joe. Because most of the founders were academics, and really at the beginning of the movement, the ritual had not yet caught up with it. But the scandal happens. And what do you think the first great scandal was of the Oxford movement? Anybody know? Actually, there were lots of scandals all the way along. The great scandal had to do with one of the three founders. No, well, metaphorically you might say that, but actually it was John Henry Newman became a Roman Catholic. So metaphorically, he got into bed with people that people felt he should have gotten into bed. But when one of the three great leaders of this movement decided that the Episcopal Church, or the Church of England, I should say, was in fact not the fullness of the expression of the Catholic faith, and joined the Roman Catholic Church, there was a great fear that the whole movement was going to fall apart. Those in the church who were vehemently opposed to the reclaiming of these doctrines used it as proof that anybody who adhered to this, and in fact many clergy were brought up by trial by bishops and prevented from performing ministry for holding beliefs that they believed were contrary to the Church of England because they held the beliefs of the Tractarians. Thankfully, even though Newman went to Rome, and now we know that he's considered, is he a saint already? They just had his canonization. Benedict went to England and declared him a saint. I know he was blessed, John Henry Newman. He was near the end of his life made a cardinal, and then at the end, and now the Roman Church acknowledges him as a saint. But if it hadn't been for the holiness and the submission to the authority of the Church by Pusey and by Keble, there would not have been really an Oxford movement to speak of. Probably the other biggest scandal that come out of it, the two of them, was the reclaiming of the use of hearing confessions, which people thought was just scandalous, and the refounding of religious orders, particularly nuns first and then eventually men's orders. Both of those things were considered really quite scandalous. But Anglo-Catholicism, what was called the Anglo-Catholic movement, really begins in 1845 when the tracts begin to move out of the university setting and begins to move into the slums themselves. The church is just not a body or a government institution. The church is, quote, a divine society and a sacred mystery, both a home for sinners and a school for saints, as the church was known, as the people of the movement were known to say. And through this, the church decided that going into the slums, one of the ways that people could begin to have a better sense of the sacred and the divine and the mystery that the church is, was for the liturgy to become more ritualized. In other words, for the more wearing of vestments, for beautiful music, for incense, and things that people whose everyday life, quite frankly, was a drudgery and a drear, and they couldn't afford to go to the symphony, and they couldn't afford to go to the opera, that they could go to their parish church on a Sunday and hear Mozart being sung, or go to their parish church and see the most beautiful set of vestments on their priest, and the candles, and the gilding, and they could give glory to God in a life that was otherwise mundane, and help to give their lives meaning. But through this, of course, this began to stir up even more fervently the evangelicals' ire against the church, because they were feeling that it was in fact too popish, too Romish for people. Remember that this time the Roman Catholic Church is still illegal for the most part in England, that being a Roman Catholic is just only being legalized for its very existence. But people in England then, and I imagine in some places still now, are very vehemently opposed. I've told a story about the head of the Orange Society in Northern Ireland, who, when the Archbishop of Canterbury was meeting with the Pope, got up at a prayer service and screamed out, "Remember Cranmer, Latimer, and Ridley," and the great archbishops of the Reformation from Fox's Book of Martyrs. So there certainly was, and still is, an anti-Romish tint even 300 years after the Reformation is over. But for these people living in the slums, it is the most beautiful thing in their lives. And it gives them meaning. The church takes on, because they're in the slum, begins to take on social ministries. Long before the government picks up the ball on taking care of the poor, it's the church who's doing job training. It's the church who's feeding those who cannot eat. It's the church who's helping people, opening up home for unwed mothers, home for prostitutes who want to get off the street. Things like that are being done by the Anglo-Catholics in the city, so that Sunday is beautiful and the rest of their life can have some meaning. And that the church is not necessarily an academic endeavor, but is a home for sinners as well as for the saints. And out of this comes the rise of religious movements. And I tell you a funny story about the founder of my religious order that I'm affiliated with, called the Society of the Holy Cross, which is in Latin is SSC. And Father Mike is also a member. This order started in England, and year, but so bad. Not like pledging where I had to memorize all this stuff. But anyway, the order was founded by a priest who was at that time a curate in a parish that had recently become Anglo-Catholic because of the clergy. And that's frequently what happens to a parish, is that the clergymen who are assigned or who are chosen for that parish have a much more Catholic bent, and they begin to teach the faith in its fullness, and then most of the people in the pews come to see the light, but there are always, again, remember, every citizen of a neighborhood is a member of the parish church in England, and there are some who just don't want their church to begin to take on ritual and candlesticks and things of that nature. So there's Father Lauder was the assistant at a parish, and at the time, the election of the wardens of the parish, remember we have a junior warden and a senior warden, the election of the wardens was done like a public election. So anybody who lived in the area could vote for a warden. So there was open campaigning. So after this priest had, these priests, the rector and the curate, had gone and were beginning to institute some upgrades to the parish, the next election of wardens pitted two different people against each other, one of who claimed that if he were elected, he would be sure to restore the church back to its real Englishness and to get rid of these Romish-style priests. So Father Lauder, Charles Lauder, decided that he was going to take matters into his own hands, and was able to find some eggs to give to a couple of boys in the parish to discourage the man with a sandwich board campaigning up and down the street. Well, that wasn't very nice of him. And although the bishop himself was much more Anglo-Catholic than he wasn't, the bishop did have to punish Father Lauder for this. So he gave him he suspended him with pay for a small amount of time, which basically became Father Lauder's punishment of having to go to France for a couple of weeks to think about what he did and how it wasn't very nice. While he was there, he picked up a copy of a book on the life of St. Vincent de Paul. And of course, we know St. Vincent de Paul from all of the thrift shops. There's one in our neighborhood, not too far from our house. And so with this Society of St. Vincent de Paul, in addition to this care for the poor through the shops, one of the things he did was he founded a religious order called the Congregation of the Mission. And this was for priests who would work primarily with the poor, but to strengthen their own ministry and their own education through mutual support and a rule of life. And so Father Lauder came back to England, having read this book, gathered together a group of other like-minded Anglo-Catholic priests, and founded the Society of the Holy Cross. And so that's where our religious order. It all came out of him being naughty, and that came to it. But the next great leader of the SSC was a guy named Father McConaughey. And Father McConaughey, during the whole rise of this ritualism, found himself in a very unfriendly diocese. And in fact, for long periods of time, found himself unable to practice as a priest. He was inhibited. For other periods of time, we've heard of priests who were jailed in England because of anti-ritual laws. And even here in the United States, during this time period, there were all sorts of conflicts. There was a parish in Philadelphia that was one of the famous, very early liturgical parishes. And they did such scandalous things as having a cross and candlesticks and flowers on an altar. I know it sounds very strange to us that would be scandalous. Even Unitarians have those things now. But those things were considered too Romish. And so this particular diocese out east had a great go-around with this particular priest in this parish.